Chapter 42. As I walked to the mailbox, I took only brief notice of the scrubby maples along the ditch that were beginning to turn color. They were being whipped by the wind, and when the storms came, their leaves would be ready to take flight. But the middle of October was too early for storms, despite Corey's predictions. But my mind was not free to reflect on the weather. My whole being was focused on my last hope, a letter covered with foreign stamps that would say what I most longed to hear. Dear Mom, I am coming home. As I looked into the box, Arlo drove up. Looks like a real blow, and if you're looking for the mailman, I don't suppose he'll be by today. It's Columbus Day, remember? I wept all the way back up the driveway. I went into the kitchen and tried to keep busy cleaning cupboards. No matter how hard I worked, it was still the same disjointed shed-type room, in a little disjointed house. It was not a place for children to entertain their friends. Freya's courtship days had slipped by while we were trying to solve problems elsewhere. That should have been our number one priority. Why hadn't we sold the Holgate house and used the Bigham inheritance to buy a nicer house in a nicer area, where the kids would have good transportation and a nice place to have their friends? I sifted flour for cookies, but then couldn't remember if I'd put in the salt and baking powder. So I doubled the recipe, put in another single quantity of salt and baking soda, and went on sifting. A wedding in a German Catholic church. Try as I would, I couldn't keep the thoughts out of my mind. The whole idea was repugnant to me. To a generation whose young men had fought in the war in Europe, the word German still had the stigma of Hitler and Holocaust. To the Norwegians, there was the hatred of a country that had overrun their country and set up a puppet government which oppressed the people. Just as sinister to me was the word Catholic, conveying popes and persecution. Starving peasants working their whole lives away to build huge cathedrals where the communicants could burn candles and beg the priest for forgiveness. So foreign to what the Baptists taught, the priest has no power to forgive, only Christ can forgive. Why hadn't we gone to a nicer church? Some big, beautiful church like the First Baptist Church downtown. That was where Dr. Carlson and his wife went. And Beth, a cousin of my mother. That's where we could have gone. Maybe Freya would have stayed home and married some nice American boy in a nice church. But no, we had spent those years when she was a teenager in a dumb little church that hardly looked like a church, imagining ourselves to be martyrs or missionaries or something. As I continued sifting the flour, mindlessly, I thought of that other time, 16 years before. A time of deep depression, when I didn't know where to turn. It was after the burial of the second twin. I had been so lonesome. I had no friends in Portland. I didn't even know my neighbors. The only people I knew were Corey's family. I didn't feel at home with them. Being in the presence of babies Nina and Tom only brought fresh hurt. It was difficult for Corey's parents to show their joy over having new grandchildren, and on the other hand, showing respect for my sorrow. They solved the problem by never mentioning it. I had missed my family in Seattle, my sisters, but more than anyone I missed Mama. I longed for the bond of the mother-child relationship. I felt that somehow Mama could make it better, but she was in sunny California. Life had gone on. I cooked and sewed and washed and ironed. As I cared for Freya and Sigurd, I tried to dispel the wrap of death around me and absorb the sweetness of the little child. During the daylight hours, I had managed to keep my head above the waters, but when the darkness crept in, I sank into the slough of despond. I had tried to make sense of the minister's words at the graveside. He had talked about the babies being in the arms of Jesus. But what did that mean beyond a sweet fairy tale sentiment? No one in the family had been able to offer any enlightenment. My family had no religious connection. Corey's family had all been baptized and confirmed in the Lutheran Church, but the only time they ever spoke of it was when they were shielding themselves from having to talk religion. The meaning of life was an expression that was never used, but my heart kept crying out, why was I born? Why am I living? What do I get? What am I giving? Finally, in my desperation, I began attending churches in the area. I would sit alone in the pew, weeping during the whole service. If I approached the ministers with a tear-streaked face and 100 questions, I was told I shouldn't take things too seriously. On a trip to Seattle, I had found a Bible in a packing crate in my parents' basement. To Florence for her faithful attendance in Sunday school. I anguished. It hadn't done her much good. She was on a constant binge. I tucked it into my luggage, determined to read it. Only one person seemed to understand my pain, my sister Dorothy. Her life was in a shambles. After her husband returned from the war, they divorced. She came to Portland for extended visits, and we'd sit and smoke and drink and talk about life. And about God. We had long ago concluded that if there was a God, he wouldn't want us anyway. We had sinned too much. But then came a phone call that had turned the winds of fate. An inconsequential call, like the dozens one gets in a lifetime. A wrong number. I had explained to Dor, some man wanted me to give a message to a Mr. Huset, but when I told him Mr. Huset doesn't live here, he gave me the message anyway. He invited me to come to some church meetings, at a little Baptist church up the street. Baptist, isn't that where they dunk people? We both laughed. It might be fun watching people being dunked, but that was fanatical. However, that evening after dinner, we hurried and washed the dishes and had the children in their pajamas ready for bed, and then we were off to church. We sat in the front pew, the organist played, the minister uttered a prayer. Then Mr. Olson, the teacher, began, "In these 5 evenings, I want to bring you an overview of the Bible." In 3 hours, he had given the most dramatic, thrilling synapse of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles. Dor and I were transfigured. The most amazing words we had ever heard, totally unbelievable. But what amazed us most was that the man believed passionately in everything he said. Dor and I discussed the lesson far into the night. We decided we shouldn't go back. It was too far out. But the next evening we were seated again in the front pew. Noah, the ark builder, Moses, the lawgiver, Abraham, the spiritual pilgrim, Joseph, the dreamer. Again we decided not to go back, but the next evening we were seated for the 3rd time in the front pew. Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. The next day Dor had planned to go home, but she changed her plans. 4 major prophets, 12 minor prophets. On the last night, Mr. Olson summed up Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the Acts, Revelation. Late into that night, Dor and I grieved at the thought that this most enlightening experience we'd ever had was over. In the days that had followed, I had wanted to go back to the little Baptist church, but without Dorothy for support, I was filled with fear. I am too much of a sinner, but maybe it is not too late for Freya and Sig. I began walking my 2 little children up to the church for Sunday school. One day Freya informed me, "They are having a special program, and we are supposed to bring our moms." That day, I walked up the street with Freya on one hand and Sig on the other, never suspecting that within the next small tick of eternity, my life would be changed forever. Corey came in the door, interrupting my thoughts. I had just taken a batch of cookies out of the oven. "Smells good," he said, and turned up his radio to catch the weather forecast.